Ahoy! The Sandworm raid is coming into New World soon, and we actually have quite a lot of information about that already. The PTR, where we would see more about it, hasn't been released yet, but AGS has released the press material surrounding it. This press material includes a variety of hints and teasers that haven't really been shown anywhere else yet. Along with that, we also have some data mining to get some additional information. The first small thing we find in the files is a screenshot of a new NPC. This is Sharif, according to the file name. And if you look closely at the location behind him, you may recognize this. This is the area where you get the quest for the Tremors in the Sand questline, which is basically the last quest that you can do at the moment in Brimstone Sands that leads up to the Sandworm. And then we have the Sandworm arena itself. This first screenshot is labeled as pre-Devourer Fight, so there seems to be some waves that you need to fight before you actually get to the Devourer. We can see a Scorpion here, which would be a beast enemy, as well as an Angry Earth with a Greatsword. This is important to point out because this may mean that for the fight itself, we not only need Beast Ward gear but potentially also Angry Earth gear to deal with this guy. But then again, this might also be just something that maybe just one tank needs to deal with while everyone else is sticking to their Sandworm gear, depending on if you can get out of combat in between. What's interesting is that this NPC has some form of shield around him, or like a half shield rather, and I'm not sure if this mechanic is something that currently exists in the game yet. I haven't seen it on a mob like that, at least. I could imagine that this is potentially a projectile barrier, especially because it doesn't fully surround the character, but it could also be something that blocks damage in another form. By the way, the gear that the characters have here is probably just chosen for aesthetics reasons for the screenshots, because the gear on the left, as far as I'm aware, is Ancient Ward gear, and the weapon on the right is a Corrupted Bane Greatsword, that's the Blade of the 19th, so I don't think we will be using all types of Ward and Bane in this fight, but rather they just chose these designs because they go well with the Brimstone look. The next image, we see 3 people beating a drum. This is titled as Summon Devourer. So it seems that you need to bang this drum in order to summon the raid boss. And that goes in line with one of the existing lore pages about the Blood in the Sands. They have this ritual where they specifically bang this drum. The ritual masters are doing that in order to summon the Sandworm, and then the Sandworm kills a few guys. I was trying to determine which role would be beating these drums, if it's something maybe healers do somewhere in the back, or if it's a tank that does that in order to pull aggro immediately. But unfortunately, the gear that they've chosen for these characters here doesn't really tell us much. We will talk about this gear a little bit later, but at least the guy on the left is wearing light armor, I'm pretty sure, along with a shield, and the guy on the right is wearing a heavier level of armor along with a bow. And then the guy in the back is wearing parts of a different gear set and is using a hammer, so it just seems to be a wild mix here. What I'm curious about is if the drums are a mechanic that you need to pay attention to throughout the fight as well. It is labeled as Summon Devourer, but it could be possible that, for example, the Devourer goes underground in between and you need to summon it again in a specific way or quickly enough before he does something else. So very interesting stuff that could be happening here, and this could be more than just a simple one-time summon event. In the back we can also see some more parts of the Sandworm arena, and you may recognize this area because it very much looks like the area where that currently empty arena spot is, with the rocks off to the side, only that there's a wooden build-up now with ramparts. And we can actually see some screenshots from the perspective on these ramparts. Before I show you those, I want to show you this real quick. You know what to do. So based on this screenshot, it very clearly looks like the ranged players will be able to position themselves on the ramparts, which will likely allow them to avoid some instances of damage. At the same time, at least in this screenshot, the Sandworm is looking directly at them, so I'm assuming there will be other mechanics that you need to deal with while being on the ramparts. I would not expect to be completely safe there. This is also indicated by the next screenshot. Here you can see another angle of the ramparts, and again we see some ranged players shooting there, but we also see the Sandworm spitting some type of acid bile. We also know from previous data mining that there are definitely various spit attacks in the Sandworm's kit, so it seems very likely that he will be able to zone off certain areas on these ramparts. We're also seeing a bunch of melee players on the left side that have been added in here. I'm pretty sure they're actually from another screenshot from an earlier promotional material and they've just been copy-pasted. So once again, I would disregard the gear here. But what I think is notable is that they specifically included them on the ramparts as well, which makes me think that there are certain phases where maybe everyone needs to go up on the ramparts and then you just need to avoid damage there. So essentially ranged only phases. This could be interesting because it may mean that the melee players may need to run a secondary offhand ranged weapon in order to keep DPSing. Another indicator of that may be that fog that you see on the ground in the screenshot. So in the bottom area below the ramparts there seem to be some toxic fumes or something, so maybe for the duration of one particular attack no one can actually be at the bottom at all, and that's why the melee players are up there. In this screenshot we're also getting a pretty good idea of the scale of the Sandworm. The arena this takes place in is not particularly large. You can look at the area in Brimstone Sands, it is just a relatively small pit. And we can see the body and the head of the Sandworm here basically just taken up a good third of the arena in itself. I'm sure the proportions may be modified a little bit for these screenshots to make him a little bit more dominant visually, but I would assume that he will take up a great portion of the arena in general. The screenshot is labeled Worm Spew, by the way, so again another indicator that this will be one of his attacks. Then there is the Devourer Chase image. Here we can see 3 guys running away from the Sandworm, while the Sandworm is kinda digging into the sand, but we also see a large part of the body coming up. The proportions of the Sandworm seem a little bit smaller here in comparison. It's not taking up quite as much of the arena, but overall it's taking up a lot because there is more of its body visible. I would assume that this attack likely deals a ton of damage if he manages to drag you down with him, but it looks like you would be able to be safe on the ramparts possibly because you're not in the sand, so maybe ranged players would still be able to DPS. With this fight appearing to have a lot of situations where melee DPS won't be able to consistently apply damage, I hope they kept that into consideration for the overall balance of the fight. In other words, I hope everyone will have to reposition consistently, not just the melee players. Otherwise, playing pure ranged could end up being too rewarding, which would, in my opinion, make the fight a bit more boring. There is also another screenshot which is labeled as the beauty shot, and one thing about this one is interesting. We can see that the Sandworm has some glowing effect around his neck, which is actually also visible in some other screenshots. This could just be an indicator for his acid mechanics, but it could also be that this ends up being his crit spot. Considering this is the first raid boss, I wouldn't be surprised if we had a bit of an unusual crit mechanic, and this would be interesting if you wouldn't have to hit the head directly, but the neck below his head, which could be difficult in some situations depending on how it's moving. Outside of the mechanics though, you've probably also noticed the new gear that these characters are wearing. First off, I quickly wanted to show this hammer. Maybe somebody knows where this is from, but I think this may be a new weapon. There are more weapons here in the background that I don't recognize at least, so maybe these are new weapons that you can get either for the Sandworm Trial in one of the quests beforehand, or from the Sandworm Trial. And then we have these armor sets. These were actually datamined quite a while ago by Jigsaw Blunderbasic in 99 on Reddit, and one of the sets I think may have been changed a little bit too. We quickly run into a problem if we're trying to determine the armor weights though, because you will notice they are using different sets. Not all of them are part of the sets that actually seem to have been data mined at the time, and they seem to have given some of them a heavy set, for example, with an unmatching weapon for someone using a heavy set just because it looked cool. Otherwise, I can't really explain some of these loadouts. So the first set, which I think is most likely to be the light set, is being used by the bow user on the left here. You can see the full data mine set here, and this could technically also be medium considering it is leather, but the other two sets seem to be more likely contenders for medium and heavy, so I would speculate this is likely the light set. The guy on the left here is also using the same set. And same for the guy on the left here, who is either using a life staff or a fire staff, so once again to me an indicator that this is likely a light set. The second set is the one being worn by the guy front and center in this screenshot. You can see the full data mine set here, and I initially assumed that this was the heavy set because it looks kinda heavy, but it could also be leather at the same time. But you got this guy up front with the hammer, so that made sense to me. But then in another screenshot, we have this guy holding a fire staff, and I would assume that a fire staff heavy user is likely not what you want to bring to the Sandworm. But this again makes me think that they probably just chose the different sets because they look cool, because otherwise things will also not add up with the third set. The third set is most clearly visible on the right in the drumming picture, but there is something interesting about it. The initial data mining for it actually had a different headpiece, while all the other pieces are the same. Now it has more of a turban look instead. But we know from a recent dev talk that they said they want the Sandworm head to be a reward for the Hatchery, which is the other 10-man trial that you're doing. So this either means that this whole set will actually come from the Hatchery, Or this means that they simply change the head for this set with something that matches the set in general more, and this will now be the reward from the Sandworm, whereas the helm itself is going over to the trial rewards for the other trial, and everyone can get it before they get to the Sandworm, maybe with Beast Sword on it. We can see this set not only on the person banging the drum that is holding a bow, but also on another person holding a bow and a spear, and also on another person using a musket. Based on the rolls using this would actually be the most likely contender for the light set, but with those shoulders it really doesn't look like a light set to me. So again, I think they're just choosing these sets because they look cool and not because they're actually matching the weight class that these rolls should be in these screenshots. On top of all that, there are also some extremely interesting screenshots for the new Heartrune, which is called the Devourer Heartrune. As you can see from the screenshot, you literally summon a sandworm from the ground when using this Heartrune. This is an extremely interesting mechanic, and I would not be surprised if this ends up being a little bit overpowered. I would think that this is some form of damage along with CC, maybe a grab of some kind, maybe a root, maybe a knockback, depending on how exactly it plays out. And we can see this in action against a mob in this screenshot as well, where the sandworm is literally biting a huge mob. According to another one of Blender Basics data mining, there are some variations of this Heartrune, just Rune Sandworm, then Rune Sandworm No Knockdown, and Rune Sandworm Chomp. The no knockdown variation to me indicates that the other two versions will in fact have a knockdown, so that would go in line with this sandworm popping up from the ground and CCing enemies. And then the Chomp upgrade is likely what we're seeing in this screenshot, so maybe there is a version where he comes up from the ground but doesn't bite, but does something else, and there's a version where he comes up and directly bites a target. Last but not least, we also get some more information about the upcoming 10-man trial in the form of the screenshots for that. All of the enemies that we can see in the screenshot so far for this trial seem to be humanoid or Varangian Knights more specifically. I think this is great because it will give the human ward and bane gear that you may have crafted for the forge another purpose. This is just speculation, but my prediction is that this trial will likely give you some very good gear to fight the sandworm. We already know that it will give you the sandworm hat, which doesn't in itself really fit with the humanoid theme that we have going on here, but it just seems logical that the 10-man trial prepares you for the 20-man trial, and that also happens through the gear that you can get. This would also explain why it's so important for them to allow you to change the attributes of the rewards from this trial, because obviously there would be a lot of overlap for different classes, but it may just be useful for all of them. It's something like Beast Sword and Refreshing, so if you can adjust the attributes to what works best for you, then you could very easily get a decent set. This will especially help players that return to New World for the Sandworm specifically, which I think there will be quite a few of. Once we have any more news about this, I will of course update you, so consider subscribing and clicking the bell if you're interested. If you want to learn more about these Sandworm abilities, I will also link you a previous data mining here that you can check out, where I go over a lot of the abilities and other leaks surrounding him. In the next days we'll also talk about the balance of power that is likely coming up soon, as well as Diablo. If you'd like to support me further and want early trading tips, you can do that on my Patreon. Thanks to my patrons for your generosity. And thank you for watching. Duke Sloth, out.